That was Meredith.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
are starting recording.
Appreciate it. So hi everyone, welcome back for I guess the new spring semester for 2021. So I wanted to kind of wait a few weeks before classes resume to start having meetings again, so that way everyone got situated, since I know it's a lot crazier than it normally has been in the past. But we are still operating virtually, and we're going to continue having monthly meetings. And I'll explain a little bit more of what we'll be doing this semester and some opportunities for you all to, for us to get some information from our members to see what we'd like to do socially this semester. So again, I just want to introduce our leaders. So I'm Stephanie Chismar, and I have Meredith Hovis, Ian, Zainab, Sophie, and Dr. Erin Sills as our other leaders that are on here today. I believe Erin's on here, but maybe not yet. And so for those that are unfamiliar with ISTF at NC State, we are now one of, I believe, 3 at least student chapters in the United States for ISTF. And we work with kind of in concert with the College of Natural Resources through trying to enhance and advocate for international perspectives in forestry and the professional practice of forestry, including the tropics, obviously. And with that, we aim to provide opportunities for advancement of science, technology, with opportunities to discuss the practice in the tropics of forestry, at least, and then also to work with the university as a whole to support these types of initiatives in our actual college, as well as throughout the rest of the university through our personal and professional development. So to kind of think back from the fall, we just wanted to kind of go back over, so those that are new, to summarize what we had completed. So our 4 chapter meetings that we had last semester, we were able to feature 3 of our NC State graduate students, and they actually all, ironically, had led research in West Africa. And so that was nice to have kind of a spotlight on that region of the world and different initiatives that our community, our students have been a part of. And then we also featured Dr. Jonah Bush for kind of a guest speaker talk on a publication that he collaborated on, looking into the costs associated with preventing another pandemic, at least related to deforestation. Next meeting, we're going to have a professor from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology speak with our group, and she has done work in Mexico, and particularly with gender roles in what's called los ejidos, which are a type of kind of mixed use, smaller scale land use that the indigenous people have been practicing in that region for a long time. We're going to, so Sophie, if you can put in the chat a Google form, the link, and then as well as the kind of the links for the movies. So we've developed a Google form that we're going to share with you all. And if you can't access it now, or for those that aren't here and have to watch this later, we'll also send an email out with the recording with this Google form and the movies links. This is just to kind of A, get an idea of who's here, and then B, get an idea of what we want to do this semester, what other activities other than just our chapter meetings, where we're kind of more doing an informal research and study abroad experience talk, to something maybe more a little bit social fun. Not that research talks aren't fun, but maybe something like watching a movie where we can turn our brains off a little bit. We also have developed a new kind of ISTF bulletin, and it's just basically a Google Doc. And so let's see, it's probably not, I'm gonna have to switch my screens. Hold on one second. Okay, you all able to see this? Okay, so we have this link included in our chapter emails, and this is going to be a place where we can include any kind of information about activities that are going on both at the university and with our partners. So we have it separated, and my computer's being slow, so it obviously doesn't want to do this, by events and kind of news, publications. So this will be a place, if you have anything you want to share with the group, we can post this here and we'll keep it rolling with up-to-date information so it's easily accessed or accessible to all. Okay, and now we're back to the screen, so hopefully everyone can see that. All right. And so there was the dates that I had mentioned, but we also have one other meeting. So each month we're going to meet on the second Friday. So that's today, and then the 12th of March. I think it was the 9th of was April. And so those will be at 12 to 1 via Zoom. And if you're new, I know I had said, obviously introduce yourself. So make sure if your Zoom name is not how you would prefer to be called, because I know sometimes it's somewhat automated. You can obviously state your preferred name and then email. So that way we can add you to our list and you can receive notifications about when we're doing new events. We also do have Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So all of our meetings that we record, we share on our YouTube page. And typically ISTF Global likes to pick those up and put kind of link them to their page. So that way they can kind of see what the student chapters are up to. And lastly, if anyone's interested in leadership, please just let any of the officers know, and we can talk about what any kind of opportunities that you would look to phase into. Typically, we like to kind of partner up people with a position to ease them in the first semester, and then the second semester they'd take it on for sure. Some bigger updates I wanted to include was ISTF Yale's conference, which is actually next Thursday through Saturday. This year is free since it's virtual. So, and you can just Google ISTF Yale Conference 2021, and it'll take it to their page. And it looks a little timely to register. You have to have like a bio and a picture. So I think they're going to try to have a little bit more of a social connection. So that way, since we all are separated and being obviously attending remotely, we can still learn from the other members. And we've been approved, the ISTF leadership, to host a workshop style presentation. So this is something our leaders are pretty excited about. So I do have the date and time now. It's going to be next Friday at 11 a.m. And it's actually looking at, the title is Inclusivity, starts with our design, participatory design workshop for inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in tropical forestry and natural resources. So we are hoping to be able to kind of provide a platform to listen to our community and other the other chapters to see, kind of facilitate and start what do we want to have as a kind of D&I working and learning group for ISTF Global as a whole. And that would be housed at NC State. So for those that are interested in diversity inclusion, this would be something we hope that we could do a one-day summit or workshop in the fall. So please let us know if you'd like to be involved with that. Lastly, so I usually include pictures of some wildlife in the tropics to try to orient us and kind of just have fun because we all love pictures. But I was like, you know what, let's do some trees. So I found this document by the World Wildlife Foundation, Living Planet Report, talking about diversity loss in 2020. So obviously with the, part of what we're going to be hearing about today, and then also our next meeting is going to be on Latin America. So I wanted to feature that region. And also, I'm sure Erin, our advisor, our faculty advisor, is familiar with this tree because she has done extensive work in Brazil. I'm going to say Guaiajuba because that sounds, I don't speak Portuguese, but I speak Spanish, so that's about the best I can try. But this was a tree that was thought to be extinct, and it was rediscovered as a part of this global tree assessment to assess what trees are still there and which ones we've lost. So I thought that was exciting. And there's that. And then with that, that's all that I have. So if we don't have any questions for me, I would like to welcome our speaker. She actually started in January with the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources, and she was previously the Tropical Resources Institute Fellow at Yale University. So I had mentioned at the beginning, if you were here, that we have a connection with the Yale University being one of our kind of partner chapters. So let's see here. I've seen a lot in the chat. Does everything seem to be going okay? Yeah, okay, good. All right, with that, I would like to welcome Meredith and invite her to share her screen and we can all learn from her.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Okay, let me see if I can.
Yeah, so this transition now.
Okay, are you seeing that properly? Yeah, great. Yeah, so thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here today. As Stephanie said, Meredith Martin, a new assistant professor. I literally just started in January, so it's always a pleasure to start to get to know new people at NC State, even if we have to do it remotely with Zoom. So I figured that the best way to introduce myself here would be just to give you a quick run through of a couple of different projects that I've been involved in over my career so far, just so that you can have a kind of a taste of the range of things that I've worked on. And if any of these spark your interest, I would obviously love to talk with people more down the line. So broadly speaking, I'm particularly interested in forest ecology research and sort of ecological silviculture research that supports community forestry, with community forest management simply as a system where local people have some level of control over their forest resources. Community forest management has been shown to be as effective, if not more effective, at decreasing deforestation compared to even protected areas. So it can be a really valuable tool both to support forest conservation, biodiversity conservation, things like that, but also is really essential to supporting human rights and environmental justice and even sustainable development. Now, a lot of community forestry projects and research are often really approached from more of a social science perspective, looking at governance or political economy, things like that. But for forest management to be really effective and sustainable, it really needs to be based on a framework of rigorous understanding of ecological theory and of real understanding of the forest ecology of the particular ecosystem. So that's where I see my research fitting in. The other thing that I really like about community forestry is there's often a focus on both non-timber forest products as well as timber. And I've been lucky to be involved with projects focused on both. And so today I'm going to talk about some non-timber forest product research that I've done. I've also had the opportunity to work in systems around the world in tropical, subtropical, temperate, and urban systems. So again, this is just going to be a sampling of a few. And for Ian, these are actually photos from Myanmar from a workshop I did in the Tanantai region through with WCS. So a taste of where you might go. So I started out, my very first research project was working on a project in Guerrero, Mexico, that was focused on a non-timber forest product called AGAVE, maguey in Spanish. And so this was a wild agave species, Agave cupreata, that was used by local communities to make MEZCAL. For those of you that don't know MEZCAL, it's a traditional liquor that's similar to tequila. So tequila is made from Agave tequilana, and MEZCAL is made from a wide range of different agave species. And this was a really fantastic introduction to this type of research. I was working with a local NGO, the Grupo de Estudios Ambientales, that was just fantastic. They had really strong relationships with the communities. This is a photo from a workshop that they were giving that was a intercambio and interchange of two different communities talking about MEZCAL. And the communities themselves were super organized and really enthusiastic about figuring out best management practices. So this was a really wonderful project. And so for the study, we used pretty straightforward forest inventory techniques that anybody who has studied silviculture or forest ecology would know, but modified for agaves instead of trees. And so we compared population densities and structures across different vegetation types and across management. So here are some, instead of diameter distributions, which you might be more familiar with, these are size classes based on agave height and maturity, seedlings, juveniles, mature, in different forest types. And this is density looking at open areas where livestock were free to roam and areas that were fenced in from livestock. And basically we found that the presence of livestock was the strongest predictor of lower agave density. So we were able to come back with some really straightforward and very practical management recommendations, which was a really nice outcome from the study. Now, in the process of making mezcal, a ton of firewood is used, both to roast the agave's heads. You can see in the
Technically,
photo
I finished everything that's due.
Oh, there you go. So here's a big pile of agave that's been roasted here. Right behind it, you can kind of see the dirt from a big pit oven here. And in the back, you can see all this wood that's used to roast these big agave's heads. And then they also use a fair amount of firewood for distillation itself. It's a easily available heat source. And then also using wood adds some more sort of smoky flavor that's characteristic of mezcal. So while I was working on this project, I started thinking more about sustainable firewood management and wondering more about it, especially since everyone who's really kind of working on mezcal is focused on the agave side of the equation, which makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of concern about overharvesting of these wild populations, but there's really kind of a lack of research on this firewood side of the equation. But I got a little bit sidetracked, as happens in the course of someone's career, right? And so I wound up getting, having the opportunity to have a grant from this juice company, Harmless Harvest. Right now they make coconut water, but at the time they were thinking about making different tropical fruit juices. And they were interested in this product, CAMU-CAMU, which is a wild harvested berry that's found in Peru and Brazil and the Amazon up here. This berry has the highest concentration of vitamin C in the world. So sometimes actually, if you look at the bottom of your vitamin C pills that you get in a drugstore, sometimes it's made from CAMU-CAMU. And then locally, it's quite tasty. They use it for juices and ice cream and things like that. And so one of my advisors, Chuck Peters from the New York Botanical Garden, had done some research on this berry back in the 1980s. And so for this project, I basically went back to that same little town in the middle of the Amazon. I managed to find his old field assistant, who at this point was in his 70s. And together we went back to this old Oxbow Lake and were able to find the same plots that he had measured and resample them about 25 years later. So CAMU-CAMU grows on riverbanks and the banks of these lakes. It's seasonally flooded. And unfortunately, the year I was there, the rainy season and the floods went unseasonably long. So normally the water should have receded at this point. And so, because I had a limited time, we wound up having to wade waist deep in the water to measure these plants. My wife, who was with me, was stung by a venomous fish or piranhas and snakes and all sorts of things. So it was a real crash course in thinking on your feet when you're in difficult field conditions, which I'm sure all of you who either have worked in the tropics or are planning to work in the tropics have experienced or will experience sometime soon. And so again, we used these sort of familiar figures, diameter distributions and things like this to try to see what was going on with these populations. So on the top here, we have the diameter distribution, basal diameter for these shrubs from 1984, and on the bottom from 2011. And these are on different y-axis scales. So this actually is much, much higher. And so you can see that there's been a big shift in population structure. So in the 80s, we had this kind of classic inverse J shape, which means there were a lot of small seedlings, saplings growing up. But by 2011, we really have shifted to this unimodal distribution. So there's not much regeneration going on. And so we might assume that this is simply an impact of overharvesting, right? If you're continually taking tons and tons of fruit out of this population, there's just not going to be enough reproductive propagules left to recruit new regeneration. But interestingly, we both happened to measure this other shrub that was found in the same stand, this Eugenia inundata in white, called Fanache. And this is a species that, was ecologically very similar. It also had a berry, but for whatever reason, this berry was not harvested, wasn't commercially valuable. And so we see that this sort of natural control was actually following the exact same shift in population. So we think that what was happening here is maybe these same shifts in flooding and climate that were making sampling so difficult were also having an impact on the ability to regenerate for these flooded populations. It's also possible, right? These oxbow lakes and riverbanks are constantly shifting as sediments are deposited and the flows of the rivers shift over time. And so we might also just be seeing kind of natural successional change as this vegetation matures and shifts into other species. But regardless, it was a really interesting reminder that, even in these wild harvested populations, we tend to really think about human disturbance as being the most important. And there's all these other factors that are always going on. And so it was really neat to be able to have that natural control to kind of try to piece that apart a little bit. But finally, I decided that I really wanted to return to thinking about this question of forest management for firewood that had come out of the AGAVE work. And the more I dug into this topic, the more I realized that there's really very little research on the basic forest management for firewood, or even on the basic ecology of many of these species that are used in Mexico or even globally. And this was really surprising to me because estimates suggest that about 80% of all wood harvested in developing countries around the world is used for energy, either firewood or charcoal. And in Mexico, actually twice as much wood is harvested for fuel compared to wood harvested for timber. So it may seem like firewood is this kind of minor product that's really used for subsistence, but actually it's incredibly important in terms of the amount of wood that's being harvested. And we can imagine that if this much wood is being harvested, it's got to be having a fairly considerable impact on forests, right? It's just not very well studied. And so around the world and in Mexico too, oak is a preferred species or tree for firewood and charcoal. Its wood anatomy means that it burns really well, it turns into charcoal really well, it has a nice flavor in the smoke. And so for MEZCAL, oak is often a preferred species. But I realized again that not only is there very little research on sort of firewood management, firewood production, there's also just very little research on oak ecology in Mexico. And Mexico and Oaxaca are really interesting places to study oak because the country is actually a center of diversity for the genus. It has about 165 of the world's 400 species. Oaxaca state has about 48 species alone. So in comparison, North Carolina has almost 30 roughly. But again, there's just very little known about the basic ecology of a lot of these species. And I think that's in part, because as you guys all know, there's a lot of research that's lacking in the tropics on sort of basic questions. But also, again, it's kind of viewed as this less important, not so commercial product compared to, commercial pine or something like that. So I decided that instead of kind of narrowing in on this very specific question about firewood for MEZCAL, that I would instead focus on, initially at least, getting a better understanding of how these mixed pine oak forests are throughout this region of Oaxaca, because it's a very important forest type throughout the country. So my study site was in the community forest of Nuevo Zoquiapan. This was an indigenous Zapotec community in Ixtlan province in Oaxaca. They have about 7,000 hectares of forest, which is about 17,000 acres, so pretty sizable. They manage about half of that primarily for commercial pine timber, which again, they manage communally, so all the profits are shared across the community. But they also harvest oak extensively throughout the entire forest for both firewood and charcoal for their own subsistence use and also to sell commercially in markets. So this was the base of my dissertation, and so there's a lot in here that I studied, so I'm only going to really touch on a few things today. Otherwise, it would be an hour 2-hour-long presentation. But so basically, I wanted to ask questions about species composition, about diversity patterns. Again, right, we have this really interesting oak and pine diversity here, and about population structure and regeneration. And I was curious to look at how these patterns would shift across elevation, because we had a pretty steep elevation gradient. So I measured 90 plots randomly located throughout the forest across this range of elevations. In each plot, we did inventory of all trees over 10 centimeters. We took measurements of slope, altitude, aspect, soil sample, all these different things to look at environmental factors. And as you can see, the slopes got pretty steep. So we adjusted the plot size accordingly to avoid bias. And I just want to mention, we also did some pretty fun work looking at growth and age of these species. We took a bunch of increment cores and a few tree cookies from both oak and pine. And we also used these steel dendrometer bands to measure growth, because we weren't really sure whether there would be annual rings. This is a subtropical region. There's no clear winter dormant period, but there is a dry season. So we kind of wanted to check whether that dry season was really going to trigger a ring formation. So I'm not going to actually talk about any of these results, but I just wanted to throw this up here in case anyone was interested and wanted to talk about it some other time. And I wanted to note that I had the opportunity here to work with a handful of undergraduate students from a local university in Oaxaca, and they happened to be pictured in these photos, and just that was a really rewarding and fantastic part of the project. And I definitely recommend anyone working in the tropics to get involved with local universities. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the results we had from the regeneration part of the study. So in broad strokes, this is a figure comparing the density of pine, so that's the Pinus genus, to the density of oak, Quercus genus, in seedlings per hectare across 4 different vegetation types. And we can see pretty quickly that pine is really struggling to regenerate under the current canopy conditions compared to oak, right? There are significantly fewer pine seedlings in pretty much every case, except for this highest community where nothing's really regenerating super well. And this makes a lot of sense, right? Around the world, in North Carolina, pretty much everywhere, pine is kind of a early successional pioneer species. It needs a lot of light. It needs a lot of disturbance in order to successfully regenerate. Whereas oak is generally a later successional species that can tolerate much more shade and kind of recruit seedlings and things under the canopy to a certain extent, right? But again, this is an area with really high oak diversity. And so I was interested in looking at, are there differences between these oak species? Are there differences potentially in the successional status of how these oak species would respond, or how these oak species would respond to regeneration treatments and disturbance? So we can get a sense of these kind of differences in shade tolerance by looking at the restructure of regeneration. So not only how many seedlings are there overall, but also are these seedlings able to persist and continue to grow into larger height classes of saplings and poles under current canopy conditions. And so again, these are height class distributions for seedlings and saplings and poles. And again, the pine species here at the top just don't have very many seedlings to begin with. And those that do, maybe they were able to recruit some small seedlings in some gap, but they're generally not able to grow up into the larger sort of sapling and pole size classes, right? So again, as we would expect, they seem to require a lot more light, be more light demanding. On the other hand, these 2 oak species, Quercus obtusata and Quercus laurina, seem to be really the most shade tolerant of the oaks that we had. They had that kind of classic inverse J distribution. So they're able to germinate lots of seedlings in the understory. And of those seedlings, they're continuously able to recruit some number of them to keep growing and keep surviving into successively larger sapling and pole size classes. This Quercus rugosa, on the other hand, seems to maybe be a bit of more of a mid-level shade tolerance, right? It's able to germinate seedlings, but it seems like it maybe needs more light for those seedlings to actually be released and keep growing into bigger saplings and poles. And then this other oak species, Quercus craquicifolia, is much more similar to the pine here, right? There's very little regeneration at all. Again, much less in the higher size classes. And so this seems like maybe this is actually a pretty shade intolerant oak that requires light in a way that a pine species might. And these patterns carried through to the diameter distributions of the mature trees as well. So those two shade tolerant species, Quercus obtusata, Quercus lorina, again, these inverse J distributions, they're able to have a lot of these little small kind of 10, 20 centimeter trees that are able to survive in the subcanopy. This Quercus rugosa, again, has fewer trees able to sort of hang out and survive in the subcanopy, more of a little bit less survival here. And then Quercus rasfolia, again, even less, more shade intolerant. And so this type of research is fairly basic in some sense, right? We're just trying to get an understanding of how these oak species are different, what their shade tolerance abilities are, what their regeneration needs might be. But all of this information is really important if we want to think about what kind of silvicultural treatments would be best to regenerate these species, what kind of management might we need to really maintain sustainable harvest of both the pine species, which are key for commercial timber for this community, and then also for these oak species, which are really important both economically, but also for their own subsistence use. And so I just want to kind of end by touching on a couple of our highlights and management recommendations. So one thing that was really neat was across the forest as a whole, we found a total of 32 tree species, and over half of these were either oak or pine. So the diversity in the forest really was located in these two clades, which was really kind of interesting. And it seems, again, like overall the community needs to create bigger openings to get that regeneration, right? Particularly that pine was really lacking. But also some of these more shade intolerant oak species like that Quercus crassifolia and even the Quercus rugosa seem to require much more disturbance and much higher light conditions to actually be released into trees, into the canopy. And how to do that should really vary depending on the elevation and the vegetation type. So I didn't really talk about the different vegetation types we found, but at the middle elevation, we had much more mesic areas, wetter areas that were more productive, had very tall canopies. And so there you'd need to make much bigger gaps in order to get the same amount of light, right? So maybe a shelter wood treatment or even a seed tree treatment would be more appropriate there. Whereas in the more xeric areas, the drier areas, they're less productive. We found those both at the very top highest elevations and also at the lower elevations. There you might be able to do more of a kind of group selection system even with some small patch cuts that would still allow for enough light from the canopy to reach in. And then I just wanted to end by again highlighting how impressive this tree diversity really was. So overall, our species richness and certainly our numbers of pine and oak species, we had 10 oak species and 8 pine species, were either comparable or in some cases even higher compared to studies in central Mexico in protected national parks. So considering that all 8 of these pine species are commercially harvested for timber, 9 of the 10 oak species are also harvested for firewood and charcoal. It's really a testament to the community's forest stewardship that they've been able to maintain this high diversity under active management and active harvest. And I think that's really impressive. And I would just note to all of you who are starting your careers and going on to research that I think, especially in kind of forest ecology work, we tend to think that we need to find systems that are more pristine and untouched so that we can test our ecological theory questions. But actually, I think it's much more interesting to work in places where there's active management. We're able to ask some pretty fundamental sort of ecological type questions about niche differentiation in an earlier part of the study, about regeneration dynamics and all these things. But also our work is hopefully able to provide some actual useful recommendations to the people who are using this forest. So I'm a big proponent of working with communities and in areas where these kind of management questions are also relevant. So that is what I have for today, and happy to take any questions, or if not, I would love to hear about some of your research as well.
Thank you, Meredith. I can start with 2 questions and then open it up. Yeah, I'll say if we want to do before that round of applause, thank you. I'll say that.
Round of applause.
And but I have 2 questions. The first one about the MEZCAL, and you said where there was livestock that was significantly, there was lower densities of it. And I was wondering if that was because of trampling or if it's because they're edible.
Yeah, it's a good question because these things, if anyone's ever seen them, they're like incredibly spiky. So you're
Yeah,
like, what?
so I was just thinking about that.
The people think it's because of trampling, and apparently the cows do sometimes eat the very smallest seedlings before they've really developed that armor.
That's what I was like, maybe when they're younger, they don't have that like thick, waxy, and then also this like spikes,
Yeah.
but who knows? And then lastly, or secondly, about the logging infrastructure in Mexico, specifically where you were doing your research in Oaxaca. So, you know, I had done research in the Peruvian, like right below Peruvian Amazon, and most of it was just hand cut, which you know, had its, there really was, I mean, they, from the picture that one of them, you had the firewood sold, most of them sold firewood like outside their homes. So it was just, and that obviously had major implications on the markets and how they manage their forests. So I was wondering kind of what the,
Yeah.
the
So
norm
yeah,
there.
there's a big difference in how they harvest and manage the pine, for the commercial pine and the firewood, which, you know, again, I was like, I think ecology research is important, but I think that would be an area for really interesting, like more social economic policy study. So the pine is all managed communally. And so they have, you know, an association that is in charge of that, and they have, you know, big logging trucks. They have loggers from the community that come with, you know, chainsaws and equipment. They don't actually have their own sawmill, so they weren't doing that. But the firewood and the charcoal is much more on a kind of, if you want to go for it basis. If you're going to sell it commercially, you need to get permission from the community authorities, but I think they're willing to give it to whoever is interested. And so, you know, if you want to do it, you have your pickup truck or you have your donkeys, and you just go and go ahead and do it. This community was pretty close to Oaxaca City, which had a sizable market. So it was only maybe an hour and a half drive. So people could bring stuff to the market in a different way than you would if you were in a more isolated community, where it probably really would be, you know, if you're selling it, it's to other community members. So that's definitely different. The community was also interesting. So in Mexico, vast majority of the land and certainly of the forest is under communal management. I think in Oaxaca, it's like 80% of the forest is under communal management. But there are restrictions in terms of what communities can do commercially. So they can kind of do what they want if it's for subsistence use, but if you're going to sell a commercial product, you need a government permit. And so most communities don't bother to get government permits for firewood and charcoal because it's just like, nobody's checking, it's not really worth it. And so it's this huge clandestine market that I think is one of the reasons that it's less studied, because it's just harder to document how much is even happening or where it's going. But this actually was one of the few communities in Oaxaca that had gotten a government permit to sell their firewood, you know, commercially and officially. But what's striking to me about that is, like, you know, no one had ever studied, they had no estimates of growth rate for any of these oak species. They had like very little data on it. So, you know, you apply for these government permits for firewood, and I think because it's firewood, they're sort of like, yeah, sure, whatever. But it's not really, you know, in terms of sustainable management, it's not based on anything real.
No, and that was whenever I was doing my research. Dr. Cubbage is on here as well. When we were trying to ask for growth rates to be able to model some of these systems for trees, and the forests were like, you know, not really sure. So we're like 5 cubic, you know, meters per hectare or something a year. And they're like, sure. I was like, okay, great. So yeah, definitely not as much literature as we have. I saw Dr. Cubbage, did you have a question? I saw you unmuted. Well, maybe not. I can't hear you, Fred.
Yeah,
Yeah, I can.
okay, so actually I was going to ask the same question. What were the growth rates for the pine and the hardwoods, perhaps?
Well, I don't remember them off the top of my head. The oaks were very slow growing. So we measured those two more shade tolerant species, the rugosa, two of them, rugosa and laurina, and then we also happened to measure two more oak species that were in the lower elevation pure oak forest. And the laurina and the rugosa were incredibly slow growing. On the dendrometer bands, we actually found shrinking in some of them because the water loss from month to month in the bark was more than the growth rate. But the more open grown lower elevation species were much faster, but pretty slow. But I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head.
So are the pines mostly lower on the slopes and the more fertile soils?
So they're kind of higher on the slopes, weirdly. The way the rain shadow effect here actually meant that kind of the middle elevations were the most mesic. So the highest points, which were over, I think our highest point was maybe 3,200 meters, so quite high. That was dominated by pretty much pure pine. There was one pine species that was a really high elevation species. And then as you move down, you got this kind of rain shadow effect and more towering pine forests with oak understory. And then at very low, when you get closer to where the villages are, it turns into kind of pure, very dry oak forest. And then if you kept going down, it would shift to tropical dry forest, basically. So it's kind of not exactly what we would expect. But, yeah.
Could I jump in? Meredith, I'm sort of continuing the same conversation about the different uses of the forest and the level of management possible. And I'm just interested in whether you thought about that as you were developing and returning management recommendations. So maybe what I'm thinking about is collection of firewood for local use versus slightly more intensive collection of fuel wood to create charcoal to sell to the cities. It seems like you've got different possibilities in terms of the types of management recommendations you could actually put into practice in those two cases, and certainly traditionally very different restrictions that you place in those two cases. So thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, so unfortunately, by the time I was the pandemic has interrupted my ability to go back and really talk with people in a way that I would have liked to. But yeah, so I had some conversations with some mezcal producers. There was one company that was much more commercial. They had a denomination of origin certification and things. And because they were a little bit more of a official mezcal company, they needed to get their firewood from legal sources, which they were having a really hard trouble finding because there just were very few communities that were like legally harvesting firewood. And so, I was definitely thinking like, well, this would be so great if we could, hook up this sustainable firewood source where we've got like real management based on real data with this sort of mezcal, and they could market it as like eco-friendly, blah, 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 blah. But it would really require a real paradigm shift in how the community thought about and managed oak. And they didn't seem ready to do that yet. But it would, on that level, I think it would need to be more of a communal, like we're all agreeing to, manage this in the right way. And we're all going to therefore share some of the profits, as opposed to, if you feel like it, go ahead and make charcoal.
So that's true for charcoal production also. It's very much lots of families as opposed to any type of sort of concentrated. There are a few families that have got the big kilns. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I mean, they were all like pretty informal kilns that they were making on the side. They didn't have permanent kilns. They were all, making the piles and covering them with dirt. So
holes in the ground, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. All kind of, and I mean, Mexico, there's all sorts of other economic dynamics going on there. So, every man that you speak to has spent time in the US working, and everyone has a family member who's in the US. So the whole kind of economic structure of the community is shifted in a really bizarre way. And so I think there's less interest and less focus on the forest as being a real economic source. They do the commercial timber and stuff, but the people who are more successful in the communities were, had greenhouses and were growing tomatoes, or, were getting remittances from the US. So I think that that's also kind of getting people back into thinking of the forest in an innovative way as being a kind of potential creative, long-term good source of income is, I don't know, it's just changing.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on this conversation also. So I actually study community forestry in the United States, very different than outside of the United States, like Mexico here. And my question is, or what we found in the United States is that, it's not very focused on the economics, like it seems, maybe like in Mexico here. And that really community forestry in the United States seems to be revolved around, this conservation or preservation of land per se. And so my question is, I guess a couple, but we'll start with, so are the community members volunteers? Do they get paid to do this? They get some of the income from whatever the source is?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things that are at play. So the way these communities are organized is they have sort of a 3-person governing body, a president, secretary, and treasurer usually, that rotates every 3 years, basically. And then they have these kind of service requirements that people cycle into. So if you're and very gendered. So if you're a man in the community, you will at some point spend a year or two kind of in service, and that's that. They do pay kind of expenses, but it's also considered sort of part of your obligation to the community. And so some of those service positions were as forest guards. They had a big committee of vigilancia that was patrolling the forest pretty continually to make sure that people from outside the community weren't coming in to take wood and things or to hunt. And then they had representatives who, so they were part of a cooperative of 3 communities that had bounded together. And so they had representatives that would serve on that committee board between the 3. So there are kind of different rotating positions that are compensated, they're paid, but it's also kind of a form of service. In terms of the logging, there's the income from the pine timber is kind of distributed into the community. But if you want to work as a logger for that season, you get paid for that labor as a logger for that season. So there's a kind of a little bit of both. And people do, and in terms of conservation, they do really care about the forest. It's not to say that it's pure economics. They harvest all sorts of, when we were going out with our field assistants, they were constantly collecting mushrooms or moss for their nativity scenes or whatever, and people really value having that, and they took a lot of pride in maintaining their forest as protected. But again, there's just a big shift, and one of the things that I'll just highlight, which was really noteworthy, is my main field assistant and guide had been working as a logger for a long time, and he knew all the different species. And in Zapotec, pretty much all the oak species have their own name, but in Spanish, they're all kind of the same. So in Spanish, there were maybe 3 names for the 10 different species, and in Zapotec, they all had their own names. But when you get to the next generation, his niece happened to be one of my undergraduate students, and she could understand some Zapotec, but really didn't speak it. And that was really common, that the new generation, they want to learn English, and of course, all their school is in Spanish. And so the amount of knowledge that is lost there is pretty staggering and depressing.
I have a question.
Not cheerful note, no.
How long did you have the dendrobands up then? Was that like a first year type of thing? You put it up and then 3 consecutive years, or?
They are actually still there, and I have assistants measuring them every 3 months. But yeah, I put them on pretty early on, and then for the sort of dissertation, I had 2 years of data on them. when we published, but I haven't published that yet. So that's on my to-do list of actually compiling all that 5 years of data that we have now, or 6 years, I don't know. But yeah.
So a little bit over, oh, no, my dogs are barking. So sorry, guys. Someone, I think I'm getting delivery, but I didn't know if there was any other questions before we wrap up. I'm going to mute now.
Hi, I have a question about your perspective about, how can I say that? If you saw a different participation and in the forest management between men and women?
Yeah, absolutely. So by far the kind of forest management aspect was entirely men. In the years that I was there, the sort of forest committee that worked with the organization my last year there had a woman on it for the very first time, simply because there were, from that particular community, there were no men who were available to do it. But by far it was all men's work, so to speak. Women collect firewood and stuff like that, mushrooms and that sort of thing. But in terms of the, it's a very patriarchal government system. So in that community there, they have an asamblea that you know, votes and makes decisions and that elects the new leaders, and women are not, do not participate in that at all. So yeah, it's an issue. But I did have some hope for change in that one of the students who I wound up starting with me at the very beginning of this project, she started as an undergrad, and then I hired her as a research assistant because she was fantastic, and she's now finishing her master's. I've been on her committee for her master's degree. So she was a woman from this community and was fabulous. And I think her involvement was kind of more accepted because she was a student and studying stuff as opposed to just being kind of a logger and working on it. So, you know, maybe things will slowly change, but that's definitely an inequality issue.
Keeping us on a cheerful note, huh, Meredith?
It's a rainy day. I don't know. It's just, you know.
It's I think it's hard sometimes to get, well, I think that's typically in research, we tend to be more focused on all the things that we need, that maybe need to be, that we think need to be improved, and not so much the things that are like, oh, yay, this is great. So life.
I will say that working in Mexico is a wonderful place to work, and Oaxaca is a fantastic place to work. And the forests there are really beautiful and well managed. So, you know, if anyone's looking for a research project, it's a good place to go.
Good to know. Say that's definitely a say, and if so, you know, talk to Dr. Sills about applying for, if we still, you know, the Zobel grant or oh gosh, well, the other one's not for the tropics, but it's okay.
Larman's for the tropics too.
Oh, yeah, that's, I was like, oh, that's right, Larman. Okay, I was thinking about the one that was for SLU. I thought.
Nicholson, right? Yes, yes.
Been a
Remembering
while,
our previous life when we used international study grants, right?
yeah. I was like, what? That was way back in like 2017. So I'll say, if there's, did anybody have any concluding remarks, any other questions? Again, I want to give a round of applause for Meredith. It was really great, especially since she just started and we kind of threw her into it. I'm like, hey, why don't you introduce yourselves to us via presenting kind of your background, as opposed to maybe introducing yourself and then share your research. So I'm very honored that we were able to have you so early on to kind of get to know you and your passions through your research.
No, my pleasure. It's I'm really thrilled that a group like this exists here, and I look forward to being participating in your events and so forth.
Thank you. Okay, well then, since we're at about the top of the hour, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. And we will be sending the link to the recording out, so that way, you know, if you want to rewatch it or want to share it with someone that couldn't attend, that you have the opportunity, as well as the information about kind of what we want to plan for this semester for any kind of social gatherings, even if it's remote, obviously remotely. Okay, so with that, thank you, and I hope you guys have a happy Lunar New Year and a great weekend.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.